Hey folks, in the last video we removed the front suspension from the basket case BMW. We ended the video with the new suspension parts laid out in front of the car. In this video we're going to install those new parts, so let's get to work. Before we start installing those new parts, we first need to address the strut towers. Let me show you what I'm talking about. First, let's take a look at the right side. I'll take one of the strut tower reinforcement plates and test fit it inside the strut tower. You can see the plate fits nicely. It's almost perfectly flush with the top of the strut tower. This is how it's supposed to fit. But with the left strut tower, the story is different. When I test fitted the reinforcing plate into this one, there was a noticeable gap. That's because the top of the strut tower is deformed, also known as mushrooming. Before we install the front struts and the reinforcing plates, we need to fix the mushrooming. The method I used to fix it is surprisingly simple. I just beat on it with a mallet. But I didn't want it to look like I beat on it with a mallet, so I used a block of wood to protect the sheet metal. I placed the block of wood on the strut tower and beat on the wood instead. Every so often, I would stop beating on it to test fit the reinforcing plate. After beating on it for a while, I finally got a good fit. After all that whacking, I still had energy left over to install the struts. However, before installing them, I first need to set the ride height. On these coilover struts, the spring preload and the ride height are adjusted separately. The instructions say the preload is already set, so I'm not going to mess with it. But I will adjust the ride height. You adjust it by moving the bottom piece higher or lower on the strut. If you move it up, that makes the strut shorter and reduces the ride height. If you move it down, that lengthens the strut and increases ride height. The instructions also say at least 80 millimeters of the strut body needs to be threaded into the bottom piece. I measured 80 millimeters up from the bottom of the strut body and marked it with a Sharpie. This is basically the maximum ride height because moving the bottom piece further down will be unsafe. I decided to leave the struts at that setting, and if they need to be adjusted in the future, I can do that. I also noticed the struts are marked left and right. So for example, this one is marked FR for front right. You may have also noticed the bottom part of the strut has these little round tabs. Those tabs fit into the slots in the steering knuckles. So when you install the strut, rotate it until the tab falls into the slot. Then you can tighten the pinch bolt. Okay, so are we finally going to install the struts? Yes we are. We're also going to install those reinforcing plates. Installing the plates is really easy. You just set it on top of the strut. Then you install the strut. It's that simple. Just make sure not to get the plates upside down. If you do get it upside down, it will become blatantly obvious when you try to install the strut. One last comment before we install the struts. The BC Racing struts came with upper mounting nuts. I thought that was nice until I compared them to the stock ones. The stock ones are beefier, so I reused them. Anyway, since these coilover struts have camber plates, I had to make sure the plates were oriented properly. The slots on the plates should be oriented left to right. I'm also going to adjust the struts to the softest setting. I can adjust it later if necessary, but for now I just want everything to be consistent. And finally, we need to attach the steering knuckles to the struts. Don't forget the tab on the strut that I mentioned earlier. Anyway, I used a floor jack to lift the hub onto the strut. The steering knuckle is basically flopping around loose, so I had to finagle it back onto the strut. I checked to make sure the strut body was bottomed out in the steering knuckle, then I installed the pinch bolt. Also, don't forget that little bracket that holds the brake line and stuff. And that's it, the struts are done. Time to move on to the next task. Next, I'm going to install the control arm bushings. These are two-piece bushings. The outer part is polyurethane, but the inner part is hard plastic. That plastic piece didn't want to fit onto the control arm. I noticed the control arms had casting seams on them, and figured that was causing the problem. So I used a file to smooth out the casting seams. And that fixed the problem. The plastic pieces were still a little snug, but that's a good thing. You don't want any slop in the control arm bushings. They installed pretty easily with some grease and a rubber mallet. Now we need to address the polyurethane part of the polyurethane bushings. I bought these bushings without the aluminum housings to save some money. So I'm going to reuse the housings from my old bushings. I just need to press the old bushings out. First I tried using my wheel bearing kit, but it wasn't strong enough. So I had to clear some junk out of the way to gain access to the hydraulic press. I was surprised how much force it took to press out those bushings. They really put up a fight. By the way, if you're wearing headphones, there's going to be some loud noises. Now we can press in the new bushings. I put some grease on them to make my life a little easier. Also notice I marked the housing with the letter F for front. These bushings need to go in a certain way and I don't want to get it backwards. The side with the lip around the edge needs to be facing the front of the car. Press in the bushing until that lip just barely touches the mounting bracket. Be careful with this or you'll destroy your new bushing. Now the bushings are ready to install. I put a healthy amount of silicone grease on the centerpiece, then installed the outer piece onto it. And last but not least, we reinstall the bushing onto the chassis. The urethane bushing is significantly stiffer than stock, which makes this step more difficult. I used a big screwdriver to help finagle it into place. Okay, so we have the struts and the control arm bushings installed. We have one last piece to install, and that is the front sway bar. But just like the other parts, the sway bar has side quests that need to be completed before we can finish the main story. One of those side quests involves the sway bar bushings. The original bushings are split down the middle so they can fit over the bar. The new bushings don't have that. I can see a seam in the spot where the stock bushing is cut, but there is no cut. Also, the bushing can't physically fit over the end of the sway bar, so I'm not sure how you're supposed to fit these bushings onto the sway bar. But here's what I did. I cut them along that seam where the stock bushing is cut, but I didn't film it. Normally, the next step would be installing the sway bar, but I bought some reinforcing plates to beef up the mounting points, and they needed to be welded onto the chassis. The new sway bar is pretty beefy, and people say it might pull the sway bar mounting studs out of the chassis. The reinforcing plates are designed to prevent that. To make room to work, I removed the front portion of the wheel well liners and the brake cooling ducts. Next, I test fitted the metal plates and marked around them with a Sharpie. I need to grind off the paint in that area, so I'll have fresh metal to weld to. I did this with my trusty Dremel and a flap wheel. And here's a photo of the plate ready to be welded. I'm not going to weld it all the way around because I don't think that's necessary. But here's something that is necessary. I disconnected the battery so the welder doesn't fry the electrical system in the car. I also used some damp rags to protect the coolant hoses and the wiring. I'm using a flux core welder and it makes a lot of welding spatter. I don't want a stray glob of molten metal burning a hole in one of my coolant hoses. The rags are nice and wet so they won't catch on fire. I don't have a welding blanket because I don't weld often enough to justify the cost. So, yeah. Anyway, let's do some welding. The welding process burned off some of the paint on the frame rail, so I cleaned it up with a wire wheel, and I painted all the bare metal with rubberized undercoating. After it dried, I installed the sway bar. If that sway bar works as good as it looks, I'm going to be a happy camper. I'm also happy because the front suspension is complete, which also means this video is complete. In the next video, we'll start working on the rear suspension. Stay tuned!